Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Use Office 365 and Teams to work with clients, partners, and suppliers. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You're welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat window on your screen. We'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions, someone will follow up with you shortly via email. If you're interested in trying out the enterprise version of Harmony, please send us a request in the chat window and someone will contact you after the webinar to get you started. We'll also make a recording of the webcast available to you within a couple of days. It's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Richard Poole, Chief Technology Officer of EMEA at Harmony. Richard heads up the pre-sales team for Harmony across the EMEA and Asia Pacific regions, working both directly with key accounts as well as Harmony's partner channel. Bringing with him almost 20 years of experience in data management systems, Richard has helped many companies to realize the significant benefits in productivity that collaborative platforms enable. Richard, please get us started.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today's session, where we're going to discuss some of the kind of pros and cons and challenges that Teams brings, and how Harmony is kind of bridging those gaps and solving those issues. So you may already know Harmony. You may have used it before, integrating to SharePoint. But we are today announcing a new version of Harmony which adds additional functionality and integration to Teams. So first off, we'd just like to kind of discuss the concept of using Teams. Obviously, Teams has been very, very successful. I think the vast majority of people are either using Teams or looking to use Teams at the moment, and have done over the last, maybe over the course of the last year or so. And Microsoft has very much been pushing the use of Teams and replacing like the likes of Skype for Business with Teams functionality, and also kind of using Teams as an interface to other underlying technologies in Office 365, like SharePoint and group mailboxes and things as well. So with that, we'd just like to ask a quick poll question.
So if you could let us know, are you already using Microsoft Teams organizational-wide, just in your department, maybe running a pilot or planning to start using Teams soon, or you haven't started using it and don't have plans in the near future? We'll give you a second to answer. And now we will show you your answers.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And thank you everybody for responding and participating. Overwhelmingly, the vast majority of you are either using or looking to use Teams. I think the biggest section there is people are planning to use Teams across the organization. So yeah, it's very, very widely being rolled out. And that's definitely the kind of trend that we're seeing. Now, Teams is great, but it does have some challenges, and there are a few challenges that we see in the market, but also with our customers and prospects and partners that we speak to. And the first one of those really is the fact that it would be great if you could just use Teams for everything, but unfortunately, for kind of external communication, external collaboration, email is still the kind of the mechanism that most people use, both to communicate maybe contractual information, but also documentation as well. And so even if you are using Teams extensively internally, like we do ourselves, for chat and instant messaging as well as collaboration, you end up having to kind of monitor two different places, Teams for your internal communication and Outlook for your external communication, both incoming and outgoing. And that is a real challenge, because you end up either, missing things, or there's a big disconnect between the two. Like, for example, if I receive an email in from a client and then I want to discuss the response and how we respond internally, then I've kind of got a switch interface, and kind of the two are very much disconnected. So with that, we'd just like to ask you another poll question on your experience with that kind of challenge.
So if you could let us know, since you've started using Teams, has the amount of email you're using increased, decreased, no real measurable difference, you don't know, or you're not using Teams? And let me show you what you've said.
Okay, excellent. Thanks again. So yeah, the biggest section of people is that there's no measurable difference. So the fact that you're using Teams hasn't actually reduced the amount of email that's going backwards and forwards, which absolutely falls in line with what we've been saying, that you're still using email in the same way as you did before, but now you've got two places to communicate and monitor information going backwards and forwards. So the second challenge is, people are using Teams, and the more you use them, the more teams and the more channels that get created, and I think that can create actually even more of a challenge of being able to find and organize and stay focused on the right information. And I think from an IT point of view, a lot of companies are finding it challenging that end users can basically create a team. Multiple people can create multiple teams all called the same thing, and they can add different people to those teams. So it can get very, very confusing quite quickly. And it's for the end user, it's really quite difficult to actually find and stay focused on the content that you're sharing with those teams. So again, we'd just like to ask your feedback.
So now that you are using Teams, are you finding it easier or harder to find documents and emails? Again, easier or harder, no difference. You're not using Teams, or you really haven't noticed. And let's show you what you said.
Excellent, thank you. And again, kind of, I think there's a spread of feedback there. Some finding it easier, some finding it harder. Some not really having too much of a difference between when they're using Teams or not using Teams. So it certainly is. It does have an impact on how you can actually find content, and it may be that different people in the audience are at different stages of rolling out Teams at the moment, so your experience may be a little bit different. And the third challenge that we see is that emails can be legal entities, and obviously the documents in those emails definitely can be in terms of contracts and negotiations and things, and kind of conforming to your company's compliance initiatives is a real challenge, and kind of Teams in some ways can kind of add to that as well, because you're creating lots of teams, lots of channels, and actually managing those and organizing and retaining the content is quite a challenge. So what we'd like to do today is actually take you through a story of an example with a couple of customers or a couple of companies that are going through a merger at the moment, Honor and Glory. And they're actually two different manufacturing companies. In this scenario, they manufacture robots, and Glory is making lots and lots of products, and Honor is looking to consolidate with a merger between the two companies. So the process of actually doing that, of going through a merger, has a lot of different implications and lots of contracts and analysis going backwards and forwards between both the two parties that are involved. And for example, here we have business analyst Megan, who's working at Glory, and she's building a business case for the merger with Honor. But she has some challenges around kind of tax implications and how to manage the whole merger process. So she's actually gone out and started to engage with a consultant, an external consultant, in this case Fred, who provides tax advice for companies like Honor and Glory. So Fred, as a tax advisor, is going to have to work with his team as well as teams from both Honor and Glory to actually pull everything together and analyze the implications and the correct and best advice to give them as part of that merger process. So there's a lot of flow between all the different parties involved, and we can see that, you know, it could start off with Megan actually sending an email to Fred asking for some clarification and some questions from a tax implication point of view. So Fred receives that email, but then his company has actually adopted Teams and is using Teams for internal communication and collaboration. And he actually has created an accounts team and various channels for the different accounts that he's working on. And he's involving his co-workers and the rest of his team and using SharePoint, Teams and Outlook and email in various different parts of that process. So they need to put together and formulate some draft advice and documentation and send those back to Megan. But again, there could be a lot of backwards and forwards, typically by email, with more questions and more advice being given. And then when the process has been finalized, Fred actually needs to retain the advice he's been giving to the client for a period of 7 years in this case. So how can that be done in a seamless and efficient manner, utilizing all the different components that we've just described with Outlook and Teams and SharePoint? It's very challenging because they're basically different interfaces, different tools, different people from different organizations, and kind of tying everything together is quite a challenge. So that's where Harmony, with the new Smart Assistant functionality being added to Harmony 8 that we're releasing at the moment, allows you to capture content into a team from Outlook and continue the conversation and the work in Teams, so that you're actually going through a flow of relating the information all together. So let's take a look at a demonstration of how that works. So we can see here in my Outlook, I've received that email from Megan. So I'm taking on the role of Fred at the moment, and I've received that email from her with some documentation that relates to it as well. Now I want to take this email and the documents, and I want to put them into my Office 365 environment. So I want to put the documents into the SharePoint site that's associated with my accounts team, and I want to communicate in one of the channels there that we've created specifically for this particular merger. So if I just drag and drop the email that I've received to that channel in the Harmony interface, you'll see that what happens is the email is actually stored against the team in Exchange, so the team mailbox. The attachments are actually taken from the email and put into SharePoint, and stored as documents in SharePoint library. And those 3 items are all being stored in one process. But what we're also doing is we're taking the metadata from the SharePoint library and exposing that to all of those entities in what we're calling descriptive labels. So it's something that we're basically extending the SharePoint metadata to content that is in Exchange and SharePoint. So I can actually use that to relate the content together. And we'll see how we can utilize that a little bit later on in the scenario as well. So in this case, I'm going to tag that with the type of inquiry that we're dealing with as a merger. And when I hit save, those items are being stored in the relevant locations and being tagged with that relevant descriptive label as well. But what I want to do now is actually communicate internally on Teams. So you'll see that I have a panel at the bottom of the sidebar where I can start a conversation around that content that I've just posted. And I can even continue that conversation in Teams directly from Harmony. So if I go to the Teams interface now, and maybe one of my colleagues is logged into Teams from a different machine or something, and I can see that Fred has actually posted that email and the documents into the relevant team repository. So I can actually open the email up just by clicking on it from the Teams interface. So in actual fact, any of my colleagues in the team could reply to that email or could refer to what was discussed. But we can also see that the attachments have been taken out of that email and the links have been created to the SharePoint locations. So I can open up those documents directly from the email here or from the Teams UI as well. So if I need to take a look at that plan, then that's actually going to open it up from SharePoint. But also my colleagues can now reply to that and we can have some internal dialogue. So we could say, let's have a meeting to discuss the applications this afternoon. So obviously now the dialogue and the conversation can take place in Teams, even though the content came from email. And what we can also do is work on that content from within Harmony as well. So if I just right-click on the channel that we have there and choose to show the files that have been captured against that particular team, you can see now that I can work on that content directly from here. So I can check in and check out the documents, work on them, see the version history and things as well. But also it might be that I need to reply back to their email with some other documentation. So if I now reply back to Megan, and I can navigate through my SharePoint sites and things and libraries that are working with that. So now it might be a case that I've got a tax advice letter that I need to send to Megan, and I can just drag and drop that into the email itself that I'm replying and sending to Megan as a reply. And I can either send that as a link or I can send it as an attachment just by holding down the Alt key while I drag and drop that document into the email. So very, very quickly, I can work with my colleagues internally and my clients externally using the email functionality in Outlook and the Teams functionality in a concise and a smooth manner. But also that tax letter, I now need to say that I need to retain that for a minimum period of time. So if I right-click on the tax letter there in the SharePoint library, I can actually apply a retention label to that, or the label could be inherited from the the library that it's been uploaded to. So I can actually apply labels maybe to the documents that we received. Let's take the structure there and say that that needs to be retained for a minimum period of time. And that means that now anybody who looks at that can see how long it's going to be retained for, but also it will be unable to actually delete or dispose that item. So if we actually look at the whole process there, we've captured the content, we've worked effectively, we've used all the tools that we need to use in the best possible way without having lots and lots of internal emails going backwards and forwards between those colleagues. But if we fast forward to, let's say, 6 months later, and Fred actually receives a similar question about another merger between, with another client, he remembers that actually he used, he wants to use and find the documentation and the advice that he actually gave to Honor and Glory in that scenario. So what he's able to do is utilize the Harmony Teams interface to actually find and retrieve information as well. Because now in the accounts team, I can filter that by the channel that we've selected, but also by the metadata that we used, or those descriptive labels. So we can see that, remember, if we tagged that content as a merger inquiry, then I can apply a filter to all the activity, all the content that was saved in that team or that channel. So I can choose to filter by lots of different information, and I can go ahead and reuse maybe or review some of the advice that we actually gave in a previous engagement. So I think the moral of the story there is that, obviously Teams is great for internal collaboration, but email is still required. And bringing those two together using the Smart Assistant functionality in Harmony 8, which we're releasing this week, allows you to connect the emails, documents, and conversations that you're having in Teams and Outlook all together in a very, very smooth manner. And with that, we'd just like to ask one final question.
So, if you would like to be contacted by a Harmony representative, please answer the question that you can see on your screen. And while you're answering that question, I will ask Richard the questions you have asked. Let's see. The first question I see is this Smart Assistant part of the updated version of Harmony that's due to be released this month?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's basically additional functionality in the new version of Harmony, so Harmony 8, which will give you the functionality that we've been showing today. You can still continue to work with the same functionality that we've had in previous versions of Harmony, but it is just basically an update to the existing Harmony that you already may well know and love.
Thank you. Okay, somebody said, our starting to use Teams is causing information to be scattered in SharePoint per Microsoft Teams and not just in their central document management system. Is that a correct estimate of the biggest challenge that they probably are facing?
Yeah, I mean, that comes back to that kind of second challenge that we identified, that, Teams is great. It's good that people can create teams and use them for kind of ad hoc purposes, really. But it does create that kind of exponential growth of different places that people can be storing their content that may be separate to your kind of more formal SharePoint document management solution. And that's where Harmony is able to give the end user a kind of consolidated view of the information, work with both of those, because it may be, in some departments, you need to use Teams. In other departments, maybe legal, for example, you want to use SharePoint with additional metadata, and mechanisms enabled to organize the content in a more structured way. But Harmony is able to actually retrieve information from both of those and give you the ability to work in the way that you need to.
Thank you. The next question is, do I need a specific setup to use the Teams functionality?
The only thing that you need specifically is to have Teams. So obviously it is only for Office 365 environments, and that you're using and you've created Teams. Once you've done that, Harmony is able to give you the option to discover the teams that you're a member of. If you install Harmony 8 for the first time, for example, it actually walks you through the process of choosing which teams that you're a member of you want to display in Harmony and utilize with the functionality we've shown today. But you can also actually do that at any point in time after you've upgraded, just to choose which teams you want to add into the Harmony sidebar.
Thank you. There are a couple more questions, but I think we're going to try to keep this to half hour. So I'm going to ask you one last question. Is there a way to show which documents have retention periods, and are those retention labels for the team, for all of SharePoint?
So the labels are coming from the Compliance Center in Office 365, and those can obviously be applied in Exchange, or they can be applied in SharePoint, and they could be different in different SharePoint sites and libraries and things as well. So it's really down to how you've got those labels enabled and configured in your SharePoint environment, and they will come through into the Harmony interface so that you can actually apply them. But also you can expose those in, for example, views in SharePoint and utilize those views in Harmony so that you could filter or group a view by the labels that have been applied to the content in those libraries.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for that wonderful presentation. Thank all of you for joining us today. You'll receive an email with a link to view the recorded webinar again within a couple of days, and we look forward to meeting you again at our next webinar. Thank you.